The rain fell softly against the windows of Balmoral Castle as Princess Anne stood in the quiet corridor outside her father's bedroom. The ancient stones of the castle seemed to hold their breath, as if they too understood the weight of the moment that was approaching. For weeks, King Charles had been growing weaker, his battle with illness taking its toll on a man who had waited so long to wear the crown he now knew he would have to pass on far sooner than anyone had expected. Anne pressed her hand against the cold stone wall, drawing strength from the solid foundation that had supported her family for generations. She had always been the practical one, the daughter who never sought the spotlight but always stood ready when duty called. Now, at 63, she found herself carrying perhaps the heaviest responsibility of her life, being the keeper of her father's final wishes for the monarchy and the family he would soon leave behind. The door to the king's chambers opened quietly, and Dr. Harrison emerged, his face grave but gentle. He had been the royal physician for over 20 years, and could read in his expression what words could not yet say. The time was drawing near. "Your Royal Highness," he said softly, "His Majesty is asking for you. He's quite alert this morning and wishes to speak with you privately." Anne nodded, straightening her shoulders in the way she had learned as a child when facing difficult moments. She had spent the morning walking the grounds of Balmoral, thinking about all the conversations she and her father had shared over the years. Charles had always confided in her differently than he did with his sons. With Anne, he could be honest about his fears, his hopes, and his deep concerns about the future of the monarchy. As she entered the room, the king turned his head toward her, his eyes still sharp despite the illness that had ravaged his body. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the silver in his thinning hair, and was struck by how much he resembled their father, Prince Philip, in his final days. "And, my dear," Charles said, his voice weaker than it had been just days before, but still carrying the authority that had defined his reign. "Please, sit with me. There are things I must tell you, things that cannot wait any longer." And took the chair beside his bed, the same chair where she had sat countless times as a child when her father would tell her stories of the royal duties that would one day shape all their lives. But this conversation would be different. This would be about the future of the monarchy itself, and the role she would need to play in ensuring that transition happened smoothly. "Father," she began, but Charles raised a trembling hand to stop her. "Let me speak first, while I still have the strength," he said. "We both know that my time is limited, and there are arrangements that must be made. But, more than that, there are wishes I have for this family, for the monarchy, that only you can help fulfill." And felt her throat tighten, but she maintained her composure. She had learned long ago that emotional displays, while natural, were luxuries that members of the royal family could rarely afford, especially in moments of crisis. Charles looked toward the window, where the Scottish countryside stretched out in all its wild beauty. This place had always been a sanctuary for their family, away from the pressures of London and the constant scrutiny of the public eye. It seemed fitting that these final conversations would happen here, in the place where he had spent some of his happiest moments as a young man. "William will be king soon," Charles continued, turning back to meet Anne's eyes. "He's ready in many ways, but he's still young, and the weight of the crown changes a man in ways that no amount of preparation can truly ready you for. I need to know that you'll be there for him, not just as his aunt, but as someone who understands the burden he's about to carry." Anne reached out and took her father's hand, feeling how fragile it had become. "Of course, father. You know I will. It's more than that, Anne. I have specific wishes for how this transition should unfold, and I'm trusting you to ensure they happen. William respects you in a way that's different from how he sees others in the family. You've never asked anything of him, never competed for attention or position. That gives you a unique authority." The king paused, gathering his strength for what he clearly considered the most important part of their conversation. "My first wish is about the coronation. I know tradition calls for elaborate ceremonies, months of planning, pomp and circumstance that costs millions. But I want William's coronation to be different. I want it to reflect the kind of king he's going to be, more connected to the people, more aware of the struggles ordinary families face." And listen carefully, understanding that these weren't just the ramblings of a sick man, but carefully considered thoughts about the future of the institution they had all dedicated their lives to serving. "The world has changed so much since my own coronation," Charles continued. "People are struggling with the cost of living, with uncertainty about the future. They need to see a monarchy that understands their challenges, not one that flaunts wealth and privilege at a time when so many are suffering. The Princess Royal nodded slowly. She had always admired her father's social conscience, his genuine concern for environmental issues and social justice. It made sense that his final wishes would reflect those values. "I want you to speak with William about this," Charles said, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "Help him understand that being a modern monarch means sometimes choosing substance over spectacle. The coronation should be dignified, of course, but it should also send a message that this new reign will be about service to the people, not ceremony for its own sake." And could already imagine the conversations this would require, the delicate negotiations with palace officials who had been planning for Charles's reign for decades, only to have to quickly pivot to planning for William's. The bureaucratic challenges would be immense, but she understood the wisdom in her father's thinking. "There's something else," Charles said, and could hear the exhaustion creeping into his voice. "About Catherine and the children. This transition is going to be hardest on them in many ways. William has been preparing for this role his entire life, but Catherine married into it, and the children, they're still so young to have their lives change so dramatically." The king's concern for his daughter-in-law and grandchildren was touching, but could see there was something more specific he wanted to say. "I want you to help Catherine find her way in this new role," he continued. "She's stronger than people give her credit for, and she has wonderful instincts about what the public needs from the royal family. But she's also going to face pressures that no amount of training can prepare you for. The comparisons to Diana will be intense, and she'll need someone in the family who can offer honest advice without any personal agenda." And understood immediately. She had watched Catherine over the years, seen how carefully she had learned to navigate royal life while maintaining her own sense of self. The transition from Princess of Wales to Queen Consort would be enormous, and having someone like Anne as a mentor could make all the difference. "And the children," Charles said, his voice growing softer as he thought about his grandchildren. "George especially is going to struggle with understanding what it means that his grandfather is gone and his father is now king. The line of succession will suddenly feel very real to him in a way it never has before." And thought about her nephew George, still just a boy but already showing signs of understanding the weight of his future responsibilities. The death of his grandfather and his father's ascension to the throne would mark the end of his childhood in many ways. "I want you to help William think about how to handle that," Charles continued. "How to let the children grieve and adjust to this new reality without being overwhelmed by the weight of what it means for their futures. They need time to be children, even as their roles in the family change." The afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the room as father and daughter continued their conversation. Outside, and could hear the distant sounds of staff going about their daily routines, but inside this room, time seemed suspended as Charles shared the thoughts and concerns that had been weighing on him during these final weeks. "There's one more thing," he said, and could tell this was perhaps the most difficult topic for him to address. "About Harry and Meghan. I know the family has been divided, and there are hurt feelings on all sides. But when I'm gone, I don't want that division to define William's reign." And felt her jaw tighten slightly. The situation with Harry and Meghan had been painful for the entire family, and she knew that Charles had struggled more than anyone with the rift that had developed. "I'm not asking for miracles," Charles continued, seeming to sense her reaction. "I know there are things that can't be undone, trust that's been broken. But I also know that in times of grief, families sometimes find ways to come together that seemed impossible before." He paused, looking directly into Anne's eyes. "I want you to be the bridge, if there's a bridge to be built. Not immediately, not while emotions are still raw from my passing, but in time. William is going to need all the support he can get, and Harry, whatever his faults, is still his brother." And considered this carefully. Her own relationship with Harry had always been cordial but not particularly close, and she had been deeply disappointed by some of the choices he and Meghan had made. But she also understood her father's perspective. He had always believed in the power of family bonds to heal even the deepest wounds. "I can't promise outcomes," she said honestly. "But I can promise to keep the door open, to look for opportunities when they arise." Charles smiled for the first time during their conversation, a weak but genuine expression of gratitude. "That's all I can ask." You've never promised more than you could deliver, and that's one of the reasons I trust you with these requests." As the afternoon wore on, their conversation turned to more practical matters: the arrangements for the funeral, the timeline for William's accession, the immediate steps that would need to be taken to ensure stability during the transition. But underneath all of these logistical discussions was the emotional weight of a father preparing to leave his children, and a daughter preparing to become the keeper of his legacy. When Dr. Harrison returned to check on the king, and could see that the conversation had exhausted him. But there was also a sense of relief in his expression, as if sharing these wishes had lifted a burden he had been carrying. "Will you think about what we've discussed?" Charles asked as he prepared to leave. "I'll do more than think about it," she replied, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "I'll make sure your wishes are honored." As Anne left her father's room, she felt the full weight of the responsibility he had just placed on her shoulders. She was about to become not just a grieving daughter, but also a crucial figure in one of the most significant royal transitions in British history. The wishes Charles had shared weren't just personal preferences, they were his vision for the future of the monarchy itself. Walking through the corridors of Balmoral, Anne began to think about the conversations she would need to have with William, with Catherine, with palace officials who would need to understand that the new king's reign would begin not with tradition for its own sake, but with a clear vision of modern monarchy that put service above spectacle. The rain had stopped, and late afternoon sunlight was breaking through the clouds, casting the Scottish landscape in golden light. It seemed like a sign, a reminder that even in times of darkness and sorrow, there was always the possibility of renewal and hope. And knew that the days ahead would be among the most challenging of her life. But, as she had done throughout her 6 decades of royal service, she would meet those challenges with dignity, determination, and an unwavering commitment to her duty to the crown and to the family that had given meaning to her entire existence. The king's final wishes would be honored, and the transition to William's reign would be handled with the care and wisdom that this historic moment demanded. 3 days after her profound conversation with King Charles, Princess Anne found herself standing in the same corridor at Balmoral, but everything had changed. The king had passed peacefully in the early hours of the morning, with Anne and William at his bedside. The moment she had been dreading yet preparing for had finally arrived, and now the real work of honoring her father's final wishes would begin. William stood by the tall windows in the castle's main drawing room, looking out at the Scottish landscape that had meant so much to their family for generations. At 41, he cut an impressive figure, tall and dignified like his grandfather Prince Philip, and could see the weight of sudden kingship in the way he held his shoulders, the tension in his jaw. In the space of a few hours, he had gone from being heir to the throne to being the King of England, and the transformation was both instant and overwhelming. "Your Majesty," Anne said softly as she entered the room, using his new title for the first time. William turned, and she could see the mix of grief and determination in his eyes. "Please, Aunt Anne, not yet. Not until I have to hear it from everyone else." Anne nodded, understanding completely. These moments of privacy, where he could still be simply her nephew rather than the sovereign, were precious and fleeting. Soon, every conversation would be filtered through the formality of his new position. "How is Catherine managing?" Anne asked, settling into one of the comfortable chairs that had witnessed countless family conversations over the decades. "She's being incredibly strong," William replied, moving away from the window to sit across from his aunt. "She's focused on the children right now, trying to help them understand what's happened while dealing with her own grief. George has been asking difficult questions that I'm not sure how to answer." And could imagine the complexity of explaining to a 10-year-old boy that his beloved grandfather was gone, and that this meant his father was now king, which would change everything about their family's life. The innocent world of childhood would now give way to the realities of royal duty in ways that no child should have to face so young. "William," and began carefully, "your father and I had several long conversations before he passed. He had specific wishes for how he wanted your transition to the throne to be handled, and he asked me to share them with you." William's attention sharpened immediately. Despite his grief, he had the political instincts of someone who had been raised for leadership, and he understood that his father's final wishes would carry enormous weight in how the monarchy moved forward. He was very concerned about the coronation, and continued. He felt strongly that it should reflect the kind of king you want to be, rather than simply following traditional expectations. She watched William's expression carefully as she explained King Charles's vision for a more modest, more connected ceremony that would signal a new approach to monarchy. The young king listened intently, occasionally nodding as he described his father's concerns about the cost and spectacle of traditional royal ceremonies in a time when so many families were struggling economically. He wanted the coronation to send a message and explained that this reign would be about service and connection to the people, not about maintaining traditions that might seem out of touch with modern realities. William was quiet for several long moments, processing what his aunt had told him, and could see him weighing the political implications, thinking through how such a change would be received by palace officials, by Parliament, by the public who had been expecting a grand ceremony. "The Archbishop will have opinions," William said finally, a slight smile crossing his face despite the seriousness of the conversation. "And I can already imagine what the palace staff will say about reducing the scale of the ceremony." Your father anticipated that, and replied. He said to tell you that being king means making decisions that might be unpopular with the establishment, but that serve the broader good of the monarchy's relationship with the people. As they continued talking, and began to see signs of the king William would become, he asked thoughtful questions about how to balance respect for tradition with the need for modernization. He wondered aloud about how to honor his father's memory while also establishing his own identity as monarch. These were not easy questions, but they were the right questions for a new king to be asking. "There's something else," and said when their conversation about the coronation had concluded. "Your father was very concerned about Catherine and how she'll handle the transition to queen consort." William's expression immediately became more personal, more protective, and could see how much he loved his wife, and how worried he was about the additional pressures she would now face. "He asked me to help guide her through this transition," and continued. "Not to manage or control, but to be available as someone who understands the unique challenges of royal life without any personal agenda or competing interests." The offer seemed to provide William with genuine relief, and had always been respected within the royal family for her integrity and her ability to stay above the petty conflicts that sometimes arose. Her offer to mentor Catherine was both practical and deeply reassuring to a husband who knew his wife was about to face unprecedented scrutiny. "She would value that enormously," William said. "Catherine has always admired your approach to royal duty, how you've managed to maintain your own identity while serving the crown faithfully," and felt a warmth at the compliment, but she also understood the challenges Catherine would face. The transition from Princess of Wales to Queen Consort would involve not just a change in title, but a fundamental shift in public expectations and media attention. Every choice Catherine made, from her clothing to her charitable work to her parenting decisions, would now be scrutinized as representing the values of the new reign. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Catherine herself entered, looking elegant despite the emotional strain of the morning. Her eyes were red from crying, but she maintained the composed demeanor that had served her well throughout her years as a senior royal. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said softly, "but the children are asking to see their father." William stood immediately, and could see him hesitate, torn between his role as a father and the duties that were already beginning to pile up around his new position as king. "Go to them," and said firmly. "The kingdom can wait a few more hours while you take care of your family." After William left, and found herself alone with Catherine for the first time since the king's death. It was an opportunity she knew she needed to take, to begin the mentoring relationship that King Charles had specifically requested. "How are you really doing?" Anne asked, gesturing for Catherine to sit down. Catherine's composure cracked slightly, and could see the exhaustion and uncertainty beneath her calm exterior. "I'm trying to be strong for the children and for William, but honestly, I'm terrified. Everything is about to change, and I'm not sure I'm ready for what that means." And appreciated the honesty. It showed that Catherine had a realistic understanding of what lay ahead, which would be crucial for navigating the challenges successfully. "Your father-in-law specifically asked me to share something with you," and said. "He told me that you have wonderful instincts about what the public needs from the royal family, and that you're stronger than people give you credit for. He wanted you to know that he had complete confidence in your ability to grow into this new role." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly composed herself. "That means more than I can say. I've always worried that I was never quite royal enough, that I was still learning how to do this job properly. My dear, and said with unusual gentleness, none of us are born knowing how to be royal. Even those of us who grew up in the family had to learn through experience, through making mistakes and finding our way. The difference is that you chose this life, which in some ways makes your commitment even more meaningful. They talked for another hour about the practical challenges Catherine would face, the increased media attention, the expanded charitable responsibilities, the protocol changes that would govern her daily life. But they also talked about the opportunities that came with her new position, the chance to advocate for causes she cared about with even greater influence and visibility. The key, and advised, is to remember that the role serves the person, not the other way around. You don't have to disappear into the position of queen consort. You can shape it to reflect your own values and interests, just as Diana did with the role of Princess of Wales, and as Camilla did as queen consort. As the afternoon progressed, other family members began arriving at Balmoral. Edward and Sophie came from London, looking somber but ready to support William during this transition. The Earl and Countess of Wessex had always been reliable members of the royal family, less visible than some but deeply committed to their duties. And found herself becoming the unofficial coordinator of family activities, helping to manage the logistics of grief while also ensuring that the necessary arrangements for the transition were being made. It was a role she had often played within the family, but never under circumstances this significant. Later that evening, as the family gathered for a quiet dinner, and watched William carefully. He was handling his new responsibilities well, but she could see the moments when the reality of his father's death would hit him anew. The grief and the duty were intertwined in ways that made both more complex and more challenging. George, Charlotte, and Louis were being remarkably brave, and could see how confused they were by the sudden changes in their family's circumstances. George, as the oldest and the heir, seemed to understand more than his siblings about what his grandfather's death meant for their future, but he was still just a child trying to process loss and change simultaneously. During dinner, and made sure to engage with each of the children, asking about their schoolwork and their interests in ways that provided some normalcy amidst all the upheaval. She had learned over the years that one of the most important services family members could provide was maintaining connections to ordinary life, even when extraordinary circumstances threatened to overwhelm everything. After the children had gone to bed, the adults gathered in the drawing room to discuss the practical arrangements that needed to be made. The funeral would need to be planned, the coronation would need to be scheduled, and the immediate governance of the kingdom would need to continue smoothly despite the transition. And found herself thinking about her father's specific wishes as these conversations unfolded. The funeral planning, in particular, would need to reflect King Charles's own values and preferences, while also serving the ceremonial needs of saying goodbye to a monarch. Your father left very specific instructions, and told William when the conversation turned to funeral arrangements. He wanted the service to reflect his environmental concerns and his commitment to interfaith dialogue. He specifically requested that representatives from multiple religious traditions be included in the ceremony. William nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like father. He always believed that the monarchy should bring people together, not create divisions. As the evening wore on, and could see that William was beginning to understand the full scope of the responsibilities he had inherited. But she could also see that he was approaching those responsibilities with the same thoughtfulness and integrity that had characterized his approach to his role as Prince of Wales. The conversation eventually turned to the question of how to announce King Charles's final wishes to the public. And realized that this would be one of her most important tasks, helping the new king communicate his father's vision for the future of the monarchy in a way that honored the past while pointing toward meaningful change. The public needs to understand that these weren't random decisions, and told William. They were the carefully considered wishes of a king who spent his entire life thinking about how the monarchy could better serve the people. As the family finally retired for the evening and felt the weight of the promises she had made to her father, the coming days would test her ability to help William navigate this transition while also ensuring that King Charles's final wishes were respected and implemented. Standing in her room at Balmoral, looking out at the Scottish landscape that had provided comfort to generations of her family, and began to plan the conversations she would need to have, the relationships she would need to manage, and the delicate balance she would need to maintain between honoring tradition and embracing necessary change. The work of ensuring a smooth transition to William's reign was just beginning, and was determined to fulfill every aspect of the trust her father had placed in her. 2 weeks had passed since King Charles's death, and London felt different to Princess Anne as her car made its way through the city streets toward Buckingham Palace. The flag still flew at half-mast, and there was a solemnity in the air that reminded her of the days following her mother's death. But there was also an undercurrent of anticipation, a sense that the nation was waiting to see what kind of King William would become. And had spent these weeks carefully orchestrating the conversations and meetings that would be necessary to implement her father's final wishes. Today's meeting was perhaps the most crucial, a gathering of senior palace officials, church representatives, and government advisors who would need to understand and support the new king's vision for his reign. As Anne entered the palace, she was struck by how different it felt now that William was in residence as the reigning monarch. The same portraits hung on the walls, the same ceremonial guards stood at attention, but there was a new energy in the building, a sense of change that went beyond the simple transition from one king to another. William was waiting for her in his private study, a room that had been rapidly converted from its previous use to serve as the king's personal workspace. He looked more settled than he had at Balmoral, more comfortable in his new role, but Anne could still see the careful way he was measuring every decision, every statement, every gesture. The Archbishop arrived early, William informed her as she took a seat across from his desk. He seems quite concerned about the proposed changes to the coronation ceremony. Anne wasn't surprised. The Archbishop of Canterbury was a good man, but he was also deeply invested in the traditional forms of royal ceremony that had evolved over centuries. The idea of significantly modifying the coronation would challenge many of his assumptions about the proper relationship between church and crown. "How much have you told him?" Anne asked. "Only that we're considering some modifications to make the ceremony more reflective of modern values," William replied. "I thought it would be better to have you explain Father's specific wishes directly." And appreciated William's diplomatic approach. By positioning the proposed changes as his father's dying wishes rather than his own preferences, William was giving the Archbishop and other traditionalists a way to accept the modifications without feeling that centuries of precedent were being casually discarded. The Archbishop entered a few minutes later, accompanied by Sir Clive Alderton, who had served as private secretary to King Charles and was now providing continuity during the transition to William's reign. Both men looked respectful but clearly apprehensive about what they were about to hear. "Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness," the Archbishop said with formal courtesy as he took his seat. "I understand there are some thoughts about modifications to the coronation ceremony that you'd like to discuss." And took the lead, as she and William had planned. "Your Grace, before his death, King Charles shared with me some very specific wishes about how he wanted his son's coronation to be conducted. These weren't casual suggestions, but carefully considered requests that reflected his deep thinking about the role of the monarchy in modern Britain." She could see both men listening intently, understanding that they were about to hear something significant. The late king felt strongly that the coronation should reflect the economic realities facing ordinary families, and continued. He was concerned that an overly elaborate ceremony might seem insensitive at a time when so many people are struggling with the cost of living. The Archbishop's expression remained neutral, but Anne could see him processing the implications of what she was saying. Sir Clive was taking careful notes, already thinking through the practical challenges of implementing such changes. His Majesty also wanted the ceremony to better reflect the religious diversity of modern Britain, and added. He specifically requested that representatives from other faith traditions be included in meaningful ways, not just as token guests but as active participants in the ceremony itself. This was where Anne expected to encounter the most resistance, and she wasn't disappointed. The Archbishop shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly wrestling with how to balance respect for the late king's wishes with his own understanding of the proper relationship between the Church of England and the Crown. "Your Royal Highness," the Archbishop began carefully, "these are certainly worthy goals, and I have great respect for His late Majesty's social conscience. But the coronation ceremony has deep theological significance that goes beyond questions of cost or contemporary sensibilities." William leaned forward slightly, ready to engage with the theological concerns while also making clear that his father's wishes would be respected. "Your Grace, I share your commitment to the spiritual significance of the coronation. But I also believe that ceremony should reflect the kingdom I'm being crowned to serve, which is a diverse, modern nation facing real challenges, and watched the careful dance of negotiation that followed. The Archbishop wasn't opposed to all changes, but he wanted to ensure that any modifications preserved what he saw as the essential spiritual elements of the ceremony. Sir Clive was focused on the practical questions of how to implement changes while managing the expectations of Parliament, the media, and the public. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, with Anne serving as the interpreter of King Charles's specific wishes while William demonstrated the kind of thoughtful leadership that would characterize his reign. By the end of the meeting, they had reached a compromise that honored the late king's vision while addressing the legitimate concerns of church and state officials. The coronation would be significantly scaled back from the elaborate ceremony that had been planned for King Charles, but it would still maintain the dignity and spiritual significance that the occasion demanded. Representatives from multiple faith traditions would be included, but in ways that complemented rather than replaced the central Christian elements of the service. After the Archbishop and Sir Clive left, Anne and William spent some time discussing how to communicate these changes to the public. It would be crucial to frame the modifications as reflecting the new king's personal values and his understanding of modern Britain, rather than as a rejection of traditional monarchy. The public needs to understand that this isn't about reducing the importance of the monarchy, William said thoughtfully. It's about making sure that the monarchy remains relevant and connected to the people we serve. Anne nodded approvingly. William was already demonstrating the kind of political instincts that would serve him well as king. He understood that successful change required careful communication and strategic timing. Their conversation was interrupted by Catherine's arrival. The new queen consort looked elegant and composed, but Anne could see the strain that the past 2 weeks had placed on her. The constant stream of condolences, official meetings, and ceremonial obligations was taking its toll, even as Catherine handled each responsibility with grace and professionalism. "How did the meeting go?" Catherine asked, settling into one of the comfortable chairs near William's desk. "Better than expected," William replied, then filled her in on the key points of their discussion with the Archbishop. And watched Catherine's reaction carefully. The changes to the coronation would affect her almost as much as they would William, and her support would be crucial for making the new approach successful. "I think your father was right," Catherine said after considering what she had heard. "The ceremony should reflect who we are and what we stand for, not just what has always been done." And felt a surge of admiration for Catherine's instinctive understanding of the political and symbolic dimensions of royal ceremony. King Charles had been right when he said that Catherine had excellent instincts about what the public needed from the royal family. The conversation turned to other aspects of implementing King Charles's final wishes. Anne had been working behind the scenes to arrange meetings between Catherine and various charitable organizations, helping the new queen consort begin to develop her expanded portfolio of patronages and causes. "There's something else your father specifically mentioned," and told Catherine. "He wanted you to feel free to shape the role of queen consort to reflect your own interests and values. He said you shouldn't feel constrained by how others have approached the role in the past." Catherine looked both grateful and slightly overwhelmed by this encouragement. "That's both liberating and terrifying," she admitted. "The freedom to shape the role is wonderful, but it also means there's no clear blueprint to follow. That's exactly why he asked me to help guide you," and replied. "Not to tell you what to do, but to be available as someone who understands the challenges and opportunities that come with senior royal roles." As the afternoon progressed, their conversation turned to the question of the children and how to help them adjust to their new circumstances. George, in particular, was struggling with the reality that his father's accession to the throne had made his own future as king much more immediate and visible. "He asked me yesterday if being king meant he wouldn't be able to have normal friends anymore," Catherine shared, her voice reflecting the pain of watching her son grapple with such adult concepts at such a young age. And felt her heart go out to the family. She remembered her own childhood, when her position as the Queen's daughter had sometimes made normal relationships challenging. But George's situation was different. He was the direct heir to the throne, and his childhood would inevitably be shaped by that reality in ways that even royal children like Anne had never experienced. "Your father had thoughts about this too," and told William and Catherine. He wanted you to prioritize giving the children as much normalcy as possible, even if it meant making choices that some people might criticize as too casual or informal. William nodded thoughtfully. We've already decided to keep them in their current schools for now, rather than moving them to more traditional royal institutions. We want them to maintain their friendships and their sense of being normal children, at least for a few more years. And approved of this decision. King Charles had always regretted some aspects of his own highly formal upbringing, and he had wanted his son to have the flexibility to raise his children with more attention to their emotional needs and personal development. As the day wore on, and found herself reflecting on how well William was handling the enormous responsibilities that had suddenly fallen on his shoulders. He was asking the right questions, making thoughtful decisions, and demonstrating the kind of steady leadership that the country needed during this period of transition. But she could also see the personal cost of his new role. The easy relationship he had enjoyed with his children was becoming more complicated as they adjusted to having a father who was also the king. His marriage to Catherine was strong, but it was being tested by the additional pressures and responsibilities of their new positions. That evening, Anne joined the family for a private dinner at the palace. It was a smaller, more intimate gathering than the formal state occasions that were already being planned, and it gave everyone a chance to simply be family members together rather than public figures performing their roles. During dinner, Anne observed the family dynamics that were emerging in this new phase of their lives. William was more serious than he had been before his accession, carrying himself with the weight of his new responsibilities. Catherine was gracious and supportive but clearly still finding her footing in her expanded role. The children were adapting in their individual ways, George with serious thoughtfulness, Charlotte with curious questions, and Louis with the resilience of a child too young to fully understand what had changed. After dinner, as the family gathered in one of the private sitting rooms, and found an opportunity to speak privately with George. The young boy was sitting somewhat apart from the others, looking out the window at the palace gardens with an expression that seemed far too serious for a 10-year-old. "Penny, for your thoughts," Anne said, settling into the chair next to her grandnephew. George looked up at her with eyes that reminded her strongly of his father at the same age, intelligent, serious, but with an underlying warmth that spoke to his fundamentally kind nature. "Anton," he said, using the informal title she had always encouraged, "do you think Grandpapa knew that everything would change so much when he died?" The question was both innocent and profound, touching on the deep philosophical questions about duty, sacrifice, and the nature of royal service that George would spend his lifetime grappling with. "I think your grandfather understood that being king means making choices that affect many people," and replied carefully. "He wanted to make sure that the changes would be good ones, changes that would help the country and make people's lives better." George considered this seriously. "Papa seems different now." "Not that different, just more serious all the time." And felt her heart ache for this child who was watching his father transform before his eyes into the kind of public figure that George himself would one day become. "Being king is a big responsibility," she said gently. "But your papa is still the same person who loves you and your brother and sister more than anything in the world. The important things about him haven't changed, even if some other things have." George nodded solemnly, and could see him trying to process this reassurance along with all the other changes in his young life. As the evening concluded and the family began to retire to their private quarters, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the progress that had been made in implementing King Charles's final wishes. The coronation plans were moving in the right direction, Catherine was beginning to find her confidence in her new role, and William was demonstrating the kind of thoughtful leadership that would serve the monarchy well in the years ahead. But she also understood that this was just the beginning. The real test would come in the months and years ahead, as the new king and queen consort worked to establish their own approach to modern monarchy while honoring the traditions and values that had sustained the institution for centuries. Standing in her apartment at Buckingham Palace, Anne looked out at the city that her family had served for generations and felt a quiet confidence that King Charles's vision for the future was in good hands. The transition to William's reign was proceeding smoothly, guided by the wisdom of a father's final wishes and supported by a family united in their commitment to service and duty. 6 months had passed since King Charles's death, and Princess Anne stood in Westminster Abbey, watching the final preparations for what would be one of the most significant coronations in British history. The morning light streamed through the ancient stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the stone floors where kings and queens had been crowned for nearly 1,000 years. But today would be different. Today, the ceremony would reflect the careful balance between tradition and modernity that King Charles had envisioned in his final wishes, and that William had worked tirelessly to implement with Anne's guidance and support. Anne adjusted her ceremonial robes as she watched the Archbishop of Canterbury review his notes one final time. The months of negotiation and planning had led to this moment, and she felt a deep satisfaction knowing that every element of today's ceremony honored her father's vision while creating something new and meaningful for the 21st century. The guest list itself told the story of the changes that had been made. Alongside the traditional array of foreign royalty, government officials, and church dignitaries, there were representatives from multiple faith communities, environmental activists, and ordinary citizens who had been chosen to represent the diverse communities that made up modern Britain. Anne smiled as she noticed Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman from Newcastle who had spent decades working with homeless veterans. She was seated in a place of honor, wearing a simple but elegant dress that had been provided by the palace. Her presence in the abbey was a direct result of King Charles's wish that the coronation should celebrate the service and sacrifice of ordinary people, not just the privileged and powerful. Catherine appeared at Anne's side, looking radiant in a gown that managed to be both regal and approachable. The past 6 months had transformed her in remarkable ways. The uncertainty and anxiety that Anne had observed in the early days after King Charles's death had given way to a quiet confidence and grace that seemed to come naturally to her. "How are you feeling?" Anne asked quietly. "Nervous, but ready," Catherine replied. "I keep thinking about everything King Charles said to you about this day, about what it should represent." Anne nodded, remembering those final conversations at Balmoral and how carefully her father had thought through every aspect of his vision for the future of the monarchy. Today would test whether that vision could be successfully translated into reality. The sound of trumpets announced William's arrival, and Anne watched as her nephew made his way through the abbey with the composure and dignity of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. He looked every inch a king, but there was also something more approachable about him than there had been about previous monarchs on their coronation day. The ceremony that followed was unlike any coronation in living memory. The traditional elements were all present: the ancient words, the sacred music, the presentation of the crown jewels. But woven throughout were the innovations that reflected King Charles's final wishes and William's own vision for modern monarchy. When representatives from different faith communities joined the Archbishop in offering blessings for the new king's reign, Anne felt tears prick her eyes. Her father had always believed that the monarchy should be a unifying force that brought people together across religious and cultural divides, and seeing that vision realized in such a concrete way was deeply moving. The environmental themes that had been so important to King Charles were subtly but meaningfully incorporated throughout the ceremony. The flowers decorating the abbey were all locally grown and sustainably sourced. The printed materials used recycled paper. Even the ceremonial robes had been chosen to emphasize craftsmanship and longevity rather than extravagance. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when William spoke directly to the nation during the ceremony, departing from the traditional script to share his own vision for his reign. His words were simple but profound, promising a monarchy that would serve all people, that would work to address the challenges of inequality and climate change, and that would always remember its responsibility to future generations. And watched the faces in the abbey as William spoke, seeing the mixture of surprise and approval as people realized they were witnessing something genuinely new and different. The formality was still there, but it was tempered with a warmth and accessibility that felt authentically modern. After the ceremony, as the royal family made their way back to Buckingham Palace for the traditional balcony appearance, Anne found herself walking alongside Edward and Sophie. The Earl and Countess of Wessex had been solid supporters throughout the transition, and appreciated having their steady presence during such an emotionally complex day. "Father would have been so proud," Edward said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Anne nodded, unable to trust herself to speak. The day had been a triumph, but it was also bittersweet, knowing that King Charles wasn't there to see his vision realized. The balcony appearance drew enormous crowds to the mall, and was struck by the energy and enthusiasm of the people gathered below. There was something different about this celebration compared to previous royal occasions. it felt more inclusive, more connected to the real lives and concerns of ordinary people. George, Charlotte, and Louis stood with their parents, waving to the crowd with the unconscious ease of children who had grown up in the public eye. And could see in George's serious expression the awareness that this day marked another step in his own journey toward the throne that would one day be his. Later that afternoon, during the private family reception at the palace, Anne had a chance to speak with William about how the day had unfolded. The new king looked exhausted but deeply satisfied, like someone who had successfully completed an enormous and challenging task. "How do you think Father would have felt about today?" William asked as they stood together near one of the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. "I think he would have been incredibly proud," Anne replied. "You managed to honor everything he cared about while also making it authentically your own." William smiled, the first genuinely relaxed smile Anne had seen from him in months. "I couldn't have done it without your guidance. Having you there to explain his wishes, to help navigate all the resistance we encountered, it made all the difference." And felt a deep sense of completion. The promise she had made to her father during those final conversations at Balmoral had been fulfilled. King Charles's vision for a more modern, more connected monarchy had been successfully launched, and William was well equipped to carry it forward. As the reception continued around them, Anne found herself thinking about the longer-term implications of the changes they had implemented. The coronation was just the beginning. The real test would be how William and Catherine used their new positions to address the challenges facing Britain and the Commonwealth. Catherine joined their conversation, bringing with her the glow of someone who had successfully navigated one of the most high-pressure public events imaginable. The new queen consort had handled every aspect of the day with grace and confidence, and could see that she was genuinely excited about the opportunities her new role would provide. "I've been thinking about what you said months ago," Catherine told Anne, "about shaping the role to reflect my own values and interests. Today feels like the beginning of that process." And was pleased to hear the enthusiasm in Catherine's voice. Over the past 6 months, she had watched Catherine grow into her role as queen consort, developing her own approach to royal duty while learning from the experiences of those who had come before her. The conversation turned to the children and how they had handled the enormous changes in their lives. George, in particular, had shown remarkable maturity in adapting to his father's new role and his own increased visibility as the heir to the throne. "He asked me last week if I thought being king would be hard," William shared. "I told him that all important jobs are hard, but that having the love and support of family makes everything easier." And thought about her own childhood, about the challenges of growing up as a member of the royal family during a time when public expectations and media scrutiny were intense but perhaps not as overwhelming as they were today. George would face pressures that even she had never experienced, but he would also have advantages that previous generations of royal children had lacked. As the afternoon progressed into evening, Anne found herself in conversation with some of the faith leaders who had participated in the coronation ceremony. Their enthusiasm for the inclusive approach that had been taken was evident, and several mentioned how meaningful it had been to play a real role in the ceremony rather than simply being token guests. Rabbi Sarah Goldman, who had offered one of the blessings during the ceremony, expressed particular appreciation for the thoughtful way her participation had been integrated into the traditional Christian framework. "It felt like genuine recognition of the religious diversity of modern Britain," she told Anne. "Not tokenism, but a real acknowledgement that the king serves people of all faiths." And remembered her father's specific wish that the coronation should reflect the interfaith reality of contemporary British society, and she felt proud that this vision had been so successfully realized. As the day finally wound down and the family began to disperse to their private quarters, and found herself alone with William and Catherine in one of the smaller sitting rooms. The formal events were over, the guests had departed, and, for the first time all day, they could simply be family members sharing a quiet moment together. "I keep thinking about that conversation we had at Balmoral," William said, settling back in his chair with evident relief. "About Father's wish that this reign should be about service rather than spectacle. I think today proved that it's possible to have both dignity and accessibility." Catherine nodded in agreement. "The response from the public has been incredible. People seem to genuinely feel that they were part of something meaningful, not just observers watching something that was happening to other people." And felt a deep satisfaction hearing these reflections. The coronation had succeeded in achieving the delicate balance that King Charles had envisioned, maintaining the dignity and spiritual significance of the ceremony while making it more inclusive and relevant to contemporary concerns. "There's still so much work to do," Anne said thoughtfully. "Today was important, but it was just the beginning. The real measure of success will be how you use this foundation to build the kind of reign your father envisioned." William and Catherine both nodded seriously, understanding that the coronation, for all its significance, was just the starting point for the real work of modern monarchy. They would need to demonstrate through their actions and choices that the changes implemented today were more than symbolic gestures. As Anne prepared to leave the palace that evening, she took one last look around the rooms where so much history had been made. The day had been a triumph, not just for William and Catherine, but for the vision of modern monarchy that King Charles had articulated in his final wishes. Walking through the quiet corridors, Anne reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. From those difficult conversations at Balmoral 6 months ago, through the complex negotiations with church and palace officials, to the careful planning and implementation that had made today possible, it had been an enormous undertaking that required patience, diplomacy, and unwavering commitment to King Charles's vision. But the result had exceeded even Anne's expectations. The coronation had successfully bridged the gap between tradition and modernity, creating something that was both respectful of the past and relevant to the present. More importantly, it had established the tone for William's reign in a way that honored his father's memory while allowing him to establish his own identity as king. As her car pulled away from Buckingham Palace, and looked back at the building that had been the center of so much of her life's work. The flags were no longer at half-mast, the period of mourning was over, and the new reign had officially begun. King Charles's final wishes had been honored, and the monarchy he had cared so deeply about was in the capable hands of his son and daughter-in-law. Anne felt a profound sense of completion and gratitude for the role she had been able to play in ensuring a smooth and meaningful transition. The future of the British monarchy was bright, built on the foundation of service, inclusivity, and genuine connection to the people that King Charles had envisioned in his final days. Today had proven that his vision was not just idealistic hope, but a practical blueprint for modern royal leadership that could succeed in the 21st century. Anne closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The promise had been kept, the wishes had been honored, and the future was secure.